You know, this session is meant again to focus more on planning, data backup and recovery planning. We won't necessarily get down into the weeds with what's the best backup solution. We can discuss that a little bit. There'll be time perhaps to look at that, but before we actually get into the subject, I just wanted to point out one thing I thought was important that came out yesterday, actually, was an announcement that kind of goes along with what we're talking about, though. It's just, you know, everyone's familiar with the Spectre and the Meltdown vulnerabilities, and while they were sending out patches, Intel was sending out patches, yesterday they made the announcement to cease and desist trying to implement their patches because they're causing problems and forcing shutdowns, and there's just a number of problems. So they said to hold off on that. So I just wanted to address that right up front because I think it's important. Okay, so with that, our agenda, we want to look at these various areas as it relates to backup and recovery. So we will be spending some time looking at planning, quite a bit actually, and then business impact analysis, why that's important when we talk about data backup and recovery. We're going to discuss the recovery time objectives and what is the difference between that and recovery point objectives. We're going to look at whether security matters when we talk about backup, data backup, and then restoration and testing. Just as a disaster, why you need to back up. You don't want this to happen and not have your data backed up. And then planning, right? I'll let you think about this. You know, you always hear about failing to plan. But if failing to plan is planning to fail, then haven't you succeeded already? So think about that here. Just some statistics as we start into it. These were some interesting statistics put out by Gartner Group. And so you can see basically there's a lot of room here, you know, for the data loss. Only 3% is natural disasters. So 31% of the data loss is due to events beyond the user control. And what that means is 69% of the data loss is really within our control. So there are different things that we can do to help prevent data loss. So I just kind of want to start out by us thinking a little bit in planning. And you'll see this is just to kind of lay some things out there to get you thinking a little bit. Think about what should be included in the planning process for data backup and data restoration. But in the planning phase, what are a few basic planning considerations? Well, how much data are you currently managing? Have some sense of the universe of data. And I think that as we go through, you might find that your perspective is different at the end with what you might think you have at the beginning. What data types do you manage? It's important to know the various types. Of course, as you know, different types of data take up more room than others. So databases perhaps, Word documents, spreadsheets, text files, emails, document images. There's quite a few organizations now that are using document imaging. We do a lot of work with banks, and they're moving more and more to document imaging for their loan files. Video, depending on the type of industry. Again, video is used a lot in security and in the banking world for security. There's a lot of video out there that they have to store and recover. And a lot of times we overlook things like the router and firewall configs, which we also need to back up. We don't want to lose those. So what's the nature of the data as well? So we talked about the type of data, but the nature of the data is important. That'll help dictate, you know, how much should be saved and also the security of it. But non-public information, do we have a lot of information that should be protected and would be a problem if it was viewed by the general public? Customer privacy, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act data. Do you have things like Social Security numbers, account numbers, you know, different tax ID numbers, things that would be considered customer privacy. Does your organization store medical data, HIPAA data? Sometimes it's overlooked because it's in HR, but there can be quite a bit of HIPAA data that's actually stored in HR that you might be unaware of and could cause problems. Just financial data, but financial data that shouldn't be seen by the general public, but what kind of data? And then some other thoughts here on the nature of the backup, the data backup, applications. So what applications should be considered? Should you consider backing up applications in your general day-to-day backup schedule? Production versus development environment. There have been several instances where organizations didn't back up their development environment and lost a lot of, well, even customer data, projects that they were working on. They didn't back up the development environment. It caused a large problem for them. And where's the data located? So we're gonna look more at that as well, being able to understand and determine where the data is located. So additional planning considerations. How critical is it to your business operations? How critical is the data? And you know, I'm just kind of generally laying out these questions now. What we're going to see in a moment, we're going to move to looking at the business impact analysis, and that's where we'll be able to kind of detail this a little bit more. That's where it should be fleshed out. How would data disruption impact your business? So that's kind of the main thought there. What is the value of the data? These are things, too, that will come out later. But the cost to reproduce the data, what's the cost to re-input all the data if that is something that has to be done? And believe it or not, that's something that we've seen in more than one case where organization had to go back and re-input a year's worth of data. Educating and coordinating with data owners, and I'm hoping to be able to re-emphasize this throughout the presentation, but all too often I find organizations try to do a data plan, data backup and resumption plan on their own in IT. So the IT department tries to do the whole thing without coordinating with the data owners, without coordinating with the different departments. They just try to do it, and you know, that's kind of a recipe for disaster. And also, you don't necessarily want that responsibility. If you go out to the data owners and you ask them how their data should be backed up, and a problem comes and you did exactly what they said, they can't blame you. So it's a good thing to get their buy-in. So looking to the business impact analysis. Why is a business impact analysis essential for establishing a data backup plan? So yeah, I guess maybe it's best with the way this was working to leave the lines closed. But I did want to ask the question and just have folks think about that for a moment. Why is it even important to do a business impact analysis for establishing a data backup plan? Should result in understanding how losing data impacts the business. You know, that's kind of the main point of the BIA is to determine understanding the impact of losing the data. You know, what's going to be the impact? The BIA is the first step in the backup planning process, and you know, things will revolve around that after you have that sorted out. It helps to ensure the backup plan aligns to best support the business. So, you know, that's kind of the goal. We want to make sure that the data being backed up, should we need to restore it, is going to be able to support the business. And so that should be another goal from the business impact analysis. So some other considerations when performing the business impact analysis. Performing the business impact analysis requires coordination with the data owners, like we said. It's not going to be as meaningful if we don't have that coordination, and we'll see why that is in some of these. But assessment and prioritization of all the business functions and the processes. To be able to do a full data inventory, to be able to properly classify the data, you really need to have that coordination with the data owners and the business. you know, an important part there again is the data inventory. There's probably a lot of data, especially on the document side, that without having the coordination with the business, you wouldn't even know existed. What we find, and perhaps you've seen it too, but it's not uncommon for users to, they don't like to go out to, let's say it's an overall ERP system, every time. What they'll do many times is they'll export that information. So they may just use one module of an application, right? So maybe they're just using the one area of Sage, and they'll export that information so that they can easily call it up, and it's important to them. And it may be even vital to whatever business area they're managing, and so it would be vital to them to make sure that that's included in the backup plan. And data classification, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on data classification, but it is helpful when setting up a data backup plan to have data classification that's given some buy-in from the data owners and the managers, so that it's classified. Hey, this data is like we had mentioned earlier, non-public data. So it's something that needs to be backed up in a different way, because if you back it up to a general area where everybody may have access to it, it could compromise the data. So data classification is important to get set at the outset in the business impact and the planning stage, so that it's backed up in the right manner and in the right place. Another point here is to give some consideration to the data interdependencies. So we don't think about that too much. It's just like, we'll just, go ahead and back up. But if we're not careful and we have a system that's feeding another system, and that's not backed up properly, it's going to have a sort of a domino effect, right? It's going to have an effect throughout the organization potentially, without properly considering the independencies. If we that goes on the restoration side as well, because if we restore data out of order that has a dependency, it could affect the full restoration of the data. So we really should consider the data interdependencies that exist during the business impact analysis phase. So how will the data lost in one department impact other departments? So we just kind of talked about that a little bit, but some of it is because the data is being fed from and transferred from one system to another. Sometimes it's just a report that one department uses, and if that report's not available, it's going to have an impact, right? So there are various interdependencies throughout the departments that are important to consider when putting together a data backup plan. So some other things to consider in the business impact analysis phase are the legal and regulatory requirements. Potentially, well, just as you know, there are certain requirements for how long certain documentation needs to be retained. Typically, financial data is supposed to be retained for 7 years, especially if there's a requirement for Sarbanes-Oxley. If it's a Sarbanes-Oxley organization, then they're going to have that requirement to make sure they retain the information that supports the financials and their Sarbanes-Oxley controls for 7 years. Perhaps the organization would be subject to violations or fines if the data is lost, depending on what that is. Medical data in the banking industry, they can be subject to fines if they don't keep people's mortgage information. You might like that if they lose your mortgage information, you don't have to pay your mortgage, but the bank is supposed to retain that for 30 years in some cases. Each department could be impacted differently, right? So that's like we said, it's good to get the coordination and the buy-in from each of the data owners and the departments because obviously they could be affected differently, so we need to get their coordination. Considering the cost to recover, there's a lot of things there that can make up the cost to recover, whether it's just time in the best case scenario. In others, it may be that that we have to go to various sources to recover the data, and it can get quite expensive. Lost time to replace if, if necessary, just being able to obtain the data or sometimes it needs to be completely re-input, right? So we might have hard documentation somewhere. All that needs to be re-entered if the data is not backed up properly. Consideration for timing and failure to meet the service level agreements. If you have a contract that requires certain data to be able to fulfill the SLAs, that could be a big problem, and you could encounter even some fines from that, right, or penalties on a contract that you were unable to fulfill because the data wasn't available in time. And then, of course, reputation damage is a big one, right? So if you can't restore the data, you lose the data. That can be a big problem. We had a bank that, I'll talk more about it, but one of our, actually it was a credit union, and they had backed up. They started to go to document imaging, and they were imaging all of their loan documentation, and they were doing it on a encrypted server, and they upgraded the server, and it affected the encryption key, and they were unable to access all of that data. They had, I don't know, 3 to 6 months worth of data lost because they couldn't unencrypt the data. Another thing, considering single points of failure. So just some thoughts in the planning stage and in the business impact analysis. And so given some thought to that for a moment in your own environment, what would be meant by consider a single point of failure? So in the realm of the data, I put there, you know, if you have one local backup, you're not backing up the data off-site, and you only have one instance of that backup. That could be a single point of failure if that facility should be inaccessible. We've had some clients experience fires, and what happens is the fire company will come and they'll want to do an investigation, and you can't access the building. It won't even look like a lot of damage, but they'll rope it off and not let anybody in, and you can't get into your backup. And if that's the only backup, you're in a lot of trouble if that's the case. And then vendors. I didn't want to lose sight of, you know, so many cases where we have vendors that have our information, and just want to consider when we're doing the business impact analysis how much of the organization data is being maintained by a vendor, and does the vendor have the same controls that we do? Are they considering and protecting our data in the same manner that we would protect it? And so it's something to make sure you consider when you're doing the analysis, and able to ask those questions and make sure that they can verify to you what they're saying, that they are protecting your data in the same manner. Okay, I'm not going to necessarily belabor a risk assessment. That's something maybe we can do for another call, but I did want to mention it. It's the next step in the process. So really you start off with a business impact analysis, and then the next step is to consider risk assessment and the different types of threats. But I will talk about the parts of it. So the components of performing a risk assessment, and it is you know, important. I know I would say probably the majority of the organizations where we go in and we do some kind of consulting with, and we look at their security or we look at their disaster recovery plan, I find that they like to skip a lot of these steps, right? Let's just get to the final, this is what we're going to back up. But you'll find by actually sitting down and giving some thought to these steps, it actually will improve your end result. You know, you really will be, it'll be, you know, more efficient, you know, rather than just saying, well, we'll just back up everything. But looking at a risk assessment, just giving some thought. So obviously the threats to the data is a major part of the risk assessment. We want to consider the inherent risk. So initially we're looking at the inherent risk of the organization. It's a risk that without any controls, this would be the risk to the data at that organization, you know, no controls. And so it could be something, you know, well, for example, again, back to our example with banking. Banking has a very high inherent risk, right, because everybody has a motive there to see what they can get and try to access the bank and see what they can exploit from the bank. So there's a lot of high inherent risk in the banking environment. We're going to consider the likelihood. So if we are considering, you know, a certain risk, let's say a fire to our data, what's the likelihood that we're really going to have a fire? You know, I would say that between, you know, in our, well, East Coast now, how many people we have from other geographical areas, but on the East Coast, it's more likely we're going to have a hurricane than an earthquake. But on the West Coast, that's different, right? So there's more likelihood that they may have an earthquake than a hurricane. So consider the likelihood in the assessment. The impact, what would the impact be? We talked about that a little bit, but this gets down to detail, looking at that given business area, and then also the component in that business area. So it's more detailed level in the risk assessment to know what the impact is. So for example, you know, you have, well, I don't know, let's say there's a department that uses spreadsheets a lot, and they have a spreadsheet that performs tax calculations, let's say. And so for the finance department, having their tax spreadsheets lost is going to be pretty impacting. So that would be a specific line in the risk assessment that would call out that data element. And then controls and the effectiveness of the controls are a big part of the risk assessment. You want to be able to see, this is kind of the proof is in the pudding, right? List the controls that are protecting that data element. You know, it can be various. So back to our spreadsheet example, yeah, you might say, well, we've got well, password protection on it. We know that those folks in finance have a logon script that forces them to back up to the server, and that server is backed up every 30 minutes, you know. So that's a control that forces that to be backed up, and that would be quite effective, I would expect. And then you arrive at your residual risk in the end. The controls, you know, as you can improve the controls, that should be able to improve the residual risk. That's what you really want to be concerned about. We mentioned the inherent risk in the beginning, and that's basically without any controls. The residual risk is what you really want to worry about, because that would determine, you know, if the controls are not effective or whether you're even able to implement a control that would bring down the residual risk. So high inherent risk isn't as concerning as high residual risk. So I wanted to talk a little bit about recovery time objective and recovery point objective, because this is a big part of being able to plan for your data backup, and it is a big part of the business impact analysis, and it can come up in the risk assessment as well. Obviously they're linked together, but recovery time objectives or recovery point objective, what's the difference? See, I'd love to be able to, I like doing live presentations because I can get more interaction in the group, but just think about that for a moment, how you would answer that. What's the difference between recovery time objective and recovery point objective? So I have the answer for you. The recovery time objective refers to how quickly the business area needs to be back up and running. And so that's usually pretty obvious. I mean, most people think about that right away. Gee, when we need to get the data, we consider the recovery time objective. You know, we need to be back up and running in 8 hours or whatever. That's pretty typical that people think about. So how quickly does the data need to be restored? So that'll go along with how quickly that business area needs to be back up and running. But like I'm mentioning here, some areas can be down for a week and others need to be back in seconds. We used to do work with the Philadelphia Stock Exchange. The Philadelphia Stock Exchange on the trading floor, they lost thousands, if not millions of dollars every other minute that they were down. So a minute downtime for them was unacceptable. And so they had to be restored very quickly. And, you know, in the medical area, that would be the same thing. You know, if we have systems that are keeping people alive, we need to make sure that there's no downtime with those. Recovery point objective, on the other hand, refers to the point the disaster occurred. So this is the one that I find most people overlook. When they're putting together their plan, they do seem to consider recovery time objective, but not usually the recovery point objective, and it can make a big difference. So that refers to the point the disaster occurred. So you would say, well, gee, if I'm backing up my data nightly, let's say, every night I do a backup, and the disaster occurred at the end of the day, I backed up my data last night, and my disaster occurred at the end of today, I'm going to lose potentially a whole day's worth of data and activity, right? So that could be big. If you can lose a day's worth, then that's fine. 2 days worth, but I would say most people aren't going to be happy about losing a day's worth of data. So to what point in time do we need to go back? That's the thing. Like, does your plan consider when the disaster occurred to understand how to recover? So, you're in the middle of performing a financial transaction, the disaster happens, and you need to know, well, what were the last transactions that were input, that were captured, and those that weren't. So even the business would have that point that they need to roll back to and where they need to start re-entering the transactions. Data's only backed up nightly, right? An entire day's activity could be lost. So that's kind of the point, recovery point objective. So how does one determine the recovery time objectives? So that goes back to the business impact analysis. And the data owner, like we said, this is one where I would want to push, if I was IT, I would want to push the responsibility to the business. The data owner is responsible to determine the objectives. They should determine how quickly they need to service the customers or vendors or whomever, that they're servicing, what their data services, what's needed to meet the service level agreements. The business needs to determine that. They should be the ones drawing that up and bringing that to IT. Now, here's the other point. IT should determine requirements to support. So if the data owner says, well, we need to have this data recovered and to this point and for this application, now IT needs to make it happen, and they need to consider, okay, what's the operating system, what application do I need to bring back so I can restore the data, and so then that starts becoming IT's responsibility. Determine the requirement to support. How quickly can the operating system be recovered to be able to restore the data? How does one determine the recovery point objectives? So again, it goes back to the business impact analysis, and like the recovery time objective, the data owner is responsible to determine objectives, what level of effort is acceptable to recreate the data. So the business owner might say, well, gee, we're fine with if we don't have that many transactions, so we're fine with the level of effort to recover a day's worth of missing data. Then their recovery point objective is going to be different from a department that says, oh no, we do so many transactions that we can't even afford to lose an hour's worth of data, an hour's worth of transactions. So, and then to consider things like what documents are available to re-input the transaction. So some departments may have documents to recover they can go back to. Others, there may not be any documentation at all, and so it can be much more difficult to recover, and in that case, of course, the recovery point objective is going to be much shorter. And then another thing to consider is an automated solution. If there's an automated solution that may exist that could help or impact the data backup, we review some applications that have a feature that's like a store and forward feature. So we have a lot of our clients now. They use a vendor where their main application is at the vendor, and they have connectivity to the vendor, and they're working off a local server. And if they should lose that connectivity, they'll store the transactions on the local server until they get back their connectivity, and then they can send up all those transactions. So if you have something like that, of course, that will impact your recovery point objective. And so it's something else to consider, because if that can be turned on, of course, then you wouldn't have to back up as much data, or you wouldn't have to have the recovery point objective to be as narrow. and then again back to the legal considerations. So you want to remember that. Again, the department, remind the department. Some of this, again, like I mentioned, is education. So a lot of the departments aren't even going to know what to think about, and being able to prod them a little bit is going to help you answer the question to have the best business resumption plan, to be able to educate them on the questions that they should be able to answer, like this. You know, hey, in your department, do you have anything that might have a legal consideration that we need to make sure we're backing up to that point? I'm not going to go into this too much, but I did want to just make sure that I mentioned it because we were talking about you know, data resumption, but consideration should be given to having we talked about data classification, and along with that, consideration should be given to having a data retention and disposal policy. And so the major point of this would be getting buy-in from the department heads, from the data owners, as to when you can get rid of their data, right? Because it's always more efficient if you can only back up the data that's necessary, and you can get rid of or archive, dispose of data that's no longer necessary. And I'm sure, like most, you're probably backing up a lot of data that nobody's using and they don't need anymore, that's got old modification dates on it. And if there was a policy, you would be able to refer to that policy and say, hey, our policy says that after 2 years, we get rid of that kind of data. So you no longer have to back it up because you're following a policy that everybody agreed to. So I just wanted to mention that. It's good to have that data classification, data retention, and disposal policy. And typically, depending on how the data is classified, that can follow the retention policy and when you can get rid of it. Always get asked about email, right? That's a big one. That should follow the data retention and disposal policy. Okay, so I just wanted to talk for a moment because I would like to move into talking about security shortly. And I thought this was interesting, different cases of data breaches. And this one was pertinent, and you'll see why as we read over it and look down. So this company, River City Media, which I don't believe exists anymore, they were a marketing firm that would help set up email blasts, spamming for different companies. And they had a problem with their backup. They did not have the same level of security on where they were backing up their data. You can see ultimately they failed to properly configure their rsync backups like production. The backups didn't have the same level of security, and so they were breached. They lost that data, or that data was compromised. And so that was a big thing for them, and they actually went out of business because of it. Another thing that we don't think about sometimes when we're considering our full data policy is our website. And you can see from this that there are quite a few websites that get defaced. And I mentioned this one. It does seem like the U.S. government is a particular target for website defacing, but it does happen in the private sector. Anything can strike the fancy of these hacktivists that we have, and also the ISIS. We've seen a few organizations, even nonprofit organizations, that were defaced by ISIS because they wanted to make a point. There was a nonprofit that worked with veterans, and ISIS defaced their page. But I bring it up because it can be a simple solution if you back up the website, right? So if you have the data backed up, you can very easily restore the website. But if it's not backed up, it'll be a problem and take a long time to fix the page. Of course, everyone's heard about the Equifax problem, and so I did want to just briefly talk about that. What happened at Equifax? Well, just a look. I mean, it was a pretty major disaster as data disasters go. Probably everybody on the call was affected by it. But just been looking at some of the facts with it, right? The big problem was they didn't address it when they should have. When it happened in March, they ignored it, and they let it continue until July. The same hackers came back. And it all revolves around patching. If they would have just patched the problem to begin with, it was an Apache problem, Apache vulnerability like many are, and they didn't apply the patch. And then what they did instead is they sold their stock, right? So the executives, when they noticed they had the problem, said, well, whoops, we'll just sell our stock and be done with that problem. And so the last thing we saw was the Department of Justice was opening an investigation on them. But going all the way down to the bottom, I put that in red because this was the reminder to me to say, make sure we back up prior to doing any kind of maintenance. Before we implement patches, especially like we had mentioned at the outset with the meltdown and the Spectre vulnerabilities, and going to apply those patches. Who knows how that's going to affect your environment? It's always a good thing to not just have your routine backup, but also back up wherever you're applying the patch, right? So before performing the maintenance, back up so that you can recover. Maybe that goes without saying. Okay, so keep moving here. We're getting near the end. Security. We want to make sure level of security. So what should be the security level of the backup data? What should be the security level? I would venture to say that many times it's not the same, but security of the backup data should be equal to or greater than production. And so let that sink in for a minute. I think everybody's scratching their head saying, what are you talking about? So why should the backup environment be more secure in some cases? When we look at that, typically the same business and monitoring controls don't exist in the backup environment. So many times you'll find, of course, that the business has some kind of reconciliations that they perform. They've got some monitoring of transactions that they perform. But if data is modified in the backup environment or tampered with in the backup environment, nobody may know about it because you don't have the same controls. And so that's why the backup environment, it may be more important even than the production environment to have security. Ensure that the cloud environment offers the same level of security. That's another big one where we're seeing problems when people say, well, we got this great solution now. We back up off-site, we back up to the cloud, and they're forgetting that the security in many of the cases is on them to make sure that they're implementing the right authorization and the right access security to the data when they back it up in the cloud. And this is something just to think about and consider. Where the data is backed up, what would prevent if you had I know that doesn't happen. We don't have dishonest IT people. It never happens, so we don't need to worry about that. But in the case that you were to hire me and I would want to tamper with your data, what would prevent the restoring of an altered backup instance? Would anybody be able to determine that? It's happened on more than one occasion where someone forced a disaster so that they could restore altered data. I'm going to talk about testing and sort of finish up with this, but test and evaluate your plan. If you have a plan that's not tested, many times it's a plan that's not going to work. And so we want to make sure you test the plan. Use the exercise results to evaluate the effectiveness and make changes where necessary. If something doesn't work, use the testing to fix it. Try to determine different types of exercises. Some of this goes back to overall disaster recovery, but it does apply to restoring data as well. It could be, in some instances, you just need to restore data for one department, maybe one individual. In other cases, you might need to restore an entire server. And so you should consider being able to go through different scenarios. If all you ever do is restore a file here and there, and the day comes when you need to restore a full server, and if you haven't gone through that exercise, it could be a problem. So learn how to conduct exercises. I put that there, too, to remind me to talk about networking, because all the individuals on the phone, this is a great forum to network, to talk about what you're doing, what's your plan like. It's a good thing to cross and ask different people how they're setting up their plan. Say consider a full restore, as we mentioned a moment ago, restoring the operating system, application, and the data. So what it's going to take to restore all those parts and not just restore a file here and there. And then document the test results, and finally the encryption key. I wanted to put that as a reminder because of our client who they did not have their encryption key backed up, and when they needed to restore data, they lost their encryption key as well, and they couldn't restore any of the data because they didn't have the encryption key. And so you want to make sure that that is part of the plan, and especially when you're doing maintenance. And so that, I'll leave this up for a moment. This will be great, right? Backup plans sometimes are so good. You want everything else to fail just to go to your backup plan. So hopefully you have a plan that's that good. And so I'll conclude with that with questions. So I don't know if we can open up the line and see if anybody had questions. You have my information there. If you want, I'd be glad to send you the presentation. We can talk more about detailed areas. Yes?
The presentation will be on SlideShare. The recording will also be on YouTube. And I'll have all your account managers follow up with you should you have any individual questions, and we'll also send out an email with all those links.
Good.
And then I did have a question come in with regards to backing up X3 specifically, and so maybe we can take this offline if it doesn't apply, but do we need to back up and recover the application server to the same point in time if the database server goes down, or just restore the SQL database?
Well, again, I think in many cases that's going to be one to go back to the data owner just to find out. In their every instance is going to be a little bit different for that case with the SQL database, right? It goes to the recovery point objective, and so if it does restore to the recovery.
Randy, one thing I want to add to the whole backup plan scenario. Okay, when you're considering your backup plan, you also want to consider the communications that you're going to do during this time, depending on the size of the backup. I don't know if it has wiped out your email servers. I don't know if it's wiped out your server room or wiped out your entire city, but you should have a plan in place ahead of time for communications when your company is down. You can use third-party things, but it should be part of your overall disaster recovery plan is the communications piece of it when things are not around to use that you own.
I do have a question. So I mean, going back to my original question about the X3, because when I signed up for this, I originally had thought that they were specifically going to talk about X3 because, in general, a lot of the knowledge that you guys have shared today, great information, and obviously it applies to a number of different things in our environment. I was thinking that they were going to specifically address some of the issues surrounding X3 and what are some best practices for as far as backing up X3 so that, like I don't know, I know obviously all the data is stored in a SQL database or Oracle if that happens to be the platform that people are using. But if my SQL database goes down and I have to restore that, and I can only restore it back to, let's say, 4 hours ago, do I have to restore my application server to 4 hours ago as well, or does that not matter? Because there's no data stored in the application server that matters from a timestamp perspective, and
Bob,
what
I
are
believe
the
you're
best
right about
practices?
that. I think you're right about that. You might want to talk to your X3 consultant for specifics on that, but I think you're right in theory about what you're saying. The SQL database is what you're going to want the freshest copy of.
Okay. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was thinking. I was like, oh, great, I can get some best practices around backup and recovery around X3 because it's kind of like the oddball in my mind. I don't have a lot, up until recently, didn't have a whole lot of experience with it specifically, but as far as all my basic file shares and Exchange and all that other stuff, I'm like, yeah, it's kind of commodity stuff, and I'm used to that. But we did have an outage about 1.5 years ago, and, you know, I was able to recover. We lost about, you know, 6 hours worth of work, which for us wasn't a lot because we were just starting to use X3, but, you know, now I'm backing up more regularly. I'm backing up transactions logs, you know, hourly, you know, these types of things, trying to make sure that I only maybe lose 1 hour's worth of work as opposed to losing 8 hours worth of work and things like that. And so I was just looking for some best practices around, you know, that the backup and recovery of for X3, you know. So that's where I was at. So.
Thank you, and maybe that's a topic I can propose to the team to consider for a future webinar. I appreciate your input.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, I appreciate everybody attending, and I think it would be a good thing. We'll discuss having something more specific in the future. This is probably a good start, though, and yeah, I think what we can do is we can even test some of these things. So I would appreciate it if folks that have joined the call would email us with additional questions like that. If you didn't want to ask now, or if you think about it later, please email us with those kind of questions, because I'd love to put something together that's more specific going forward.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. This will conclude our webinar. Again, the recording will be up on YouTube within 24 hours and on SlideShare. I will send you an email with those links. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Bob. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Take care.